It had been just over a year since the infamous battle, Custer's final stand on the Little Bighorn River. By the summer of 1877, we were camped along the Tongue River, not far from the towering Bighorn Mountains. Our orders came down for a detail. A small group of officers wanted to visit the scene where Custer and his men met their tragic end. They had questions, and we were to escort them to the battlefield. Some of the older scouts said it was a quick ride, a mere 25 miles from our camp to where the battle had been fought. Others, more cautious, swore it was closer to 30. But after 2 solid days of riding through rough terrain, from the headwaters of the Little Bighorn in the mountains, near where General Miles now held his headquarters, we figured it was closer to 45 miles. No one had bothered to measure, but we were all certain by the time we arrived. The land was striking, and hard to forget. We started out on a plateau, flat and expansive, that gently sloped down toward the river below. The ground was as even as any farmer would wish for his field, with only a few scattered streams and ridges breaking the smooth line of the land. To the east and west, the land was framed by bluffs that rose from the earth like giant walls, rough, jagged, and unforgiving. From where we stood, we could see the course of the Little Bighorn River cutting its way through the valley, glittering in the sun, winding its way between narrow gaps in the cliffs. In the distance to the south, near where Major Reno had made his stand, the bluffs dropped sharply, forming a barrier that had trapped Custer and his men. The northern edge of the battlefield was hidden by the same rugged terrain, but the land beyond it was stark and open. We'd need to ride through one of those gaps if we were to cross over to the other side. In every direction, you could see the marks of the land's wild nature. Sparse timber, the occasional trickle of water, and a horizon that stretched forever. Beyond the bluffs and the valley floor, the Wolf Mountains rose like silent sentinels, their sun-baked ridgelines casting long shadows on the land below. The valley floor was a stark contrast, lush in some areas, full of green grass and wildflowers in every shade imaginable, yet in other places, it was dry, cracked, and barren. It was a landscape both beautiful and harsh, full of contradictions, much like the battle that had unfolded here only a year before. After what felt like an eternity in the saddle, we finally reached the site of the old Indian village, a place now marked by the remnants of a tragedy. The land here was different. The valley itself stretched for about 4 miles, with a width of half a mile, nestled right beside the river. The ground had once been covered by a decent stand of timber, but much of it had been cut down over the years. The local women, the squaws, had felled the trees to gather bark for their ponies' winter feed, leaving the center of the village nearly barren. There were still traces of what it had once been, but time had taken its toll. We made our way south, passing through a dense thicket of underbrush that stretched across 3 or 4 acres, thick enough to hide a small army. This was the place where the women and children, the squaws and papooses, had taken refuge when Custer's men drew near. They stayed hidden in the thick brush, out of sight, while the cavalry unknowingly marched into the trap that would seal their fate. Beyond that dense grove, the scene grew even more unusual. Teepee poles and lodge support stood in every direction, crammed together in a tangle of branches. It was as if the village had been hastily abandoned, the remnants of the camp scattered across the ground in chaos. Blankets, hides, and pieces of broken camp equipment were scattered about, left behind in the rush to flee. One thing that caught the eye, though, was the large number of leggings strewn across the dirt. It didn't take much to figure out why. The Indians had discarded their own clothing in favor of the soldiers' uniforms. It was a grim reminder of the battle's savage nature. Clothing had become a spoil of war, taken from the dead in a swift, ruthless fashion. As we moved on, we came across a series of 6 burial scaffolds. These makeshift memorials were perched above the ground, their wooden frames straining against the wind, each holding the body of a fallen warrior. Beneath them, scattered across the earth, were the bones of 6 Sioux men. One of the skulls had been pierced by a rifle bullet, still holding the lead in its shattered bones, a haunting symbol of the violent encounter. There were also tales from men who had survived the battle. William Edgerly, a member of Custer's 7th Cavalry, later recalled what a Sioux warrior named Low Dog had told him about the bodies left behind by the retreating Sioux. They had moved swiftly after the fight, leaving many of their dead behind as they fled into the hills. Young Hawk, an Arikara scout who had been with the cavalry, also spoke of the discovery of a former Sioux scout's body, a man named Chatka. His corpse, riddled with wounds, had been left in the open as a grim marker of the chaos that had engulfed the battlefield. By the time we reached the lower ford, where the Little Bighorn River stretched wide, it was nearly dark. We had ridden deep into the abandoned village, and our strength was wearing thin. Cold, wet, and hungry, we set up camp for the night. Supper was hastily prepared over the fire, the warmth from the flames a fleeting relief against the chill that seemed to have settled in our bones. After eating, we sat around for a brief smoke, then spread out our damp blankets on the cold, hard ground, hoping to get some rest. But sleep was not to be had. The night air was filled with the shrill howls of coyotes, their eerie cries cutting through the dark like a warning. Their calls grew louder, more persistent, as if they were angry at being deprived of their usual nightly feast, the scraps of muscle and meat left on bones by the battlefield's fallen warriors. We had barely settled in when a sudden scream split the air. Jack Healy, who had been lying next to me, shot upright, his voice sharp and panicked. Snakes. He had felt something cold and slippery slither across his face in the dark. His yell echoed through the camp as everyone sprang into action. Our fire was quickly stoked back to life, and we grabbed our sabers, prepared to fight whatever threat had slithered into our midst. What followed, however, was no snake attack. We found lizards, hundreds of them, crawling over our blankets, our gear, and the ground around us. They were small but unnerving, their slimy green bodies wriggling over every surface. We set to work, dispatching them one by one, the crack of our blades striking the earth as we fought back against the relentless swarm. Once the last lizard had been killed, we tried to go back to sleep. But the fear of another attack from the slimy creatures kept us awake. It wasn't long before another man cried out, feeling one of the lizards crawl over him. And so the cycle continued, as we rose again and again, hunting down the unwelcome intruders in the dark. By the time the first light of morning began to break over the horizon, we were all exhausted, mentally, physically, and emotionally. Sleep had eluded us entirely. We had survived the night, but it had been no peaceful rest. After a hasty breakfast, we began our grim ride across the battlefield, this land that had become infamous as the site where General George Custer and his 300 men of the 7th Cavalry met their end just over a year ago. It was here, on the Little Bighorn, that Custer's forces were surrounded and slaughtered by a vastly superior force of Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, some 3,000 strong, commanded by Sitting Bull. Yet, despite the horror and heroism of that day, not a single one of the attackers has ever been held accountable for the bloodshed. Worse still, many of these very same warriors, who had fought against the United States Army, are now receiving government support, living under the same flag they once fought to topple. And the ultimate irony, some of the soldiers who survived that battle now live side by side with the same men who helped bring about Custer's fall. As we moved through the area, it became clear just how badly the dead had been neglected. The bodies of our comrades had never been properly interred. Over the months, the bones of the brave men who died here had remained on the open ground, picked clean by wolves, vultures, and the elements. It was a pitiful sight, our comrades, left to rot where they fell, their remains dishonored, their sacrifices seemingly forgotten. This was the sad result of Major Reno's failure to provide the promised support. Despite his position in the field, Reno's forces were unable, or perhaps unwilling, to come to Custer's aid, leaving the men to die in what would become one of the most disastrous defeats in American military history. 2 days after the battle, a small detachment had been sent to retrieve the bodies, but the attempt at burial was half-hearted at best. The graves were shallow, and the scant dirt thrown over the bodies was soon washed away by rain or dug up by scavengers. There was no dignity, no respect for the fallen. Just the harsh reality of a battle that had gone horribly wrong. Crossing the Little Bighorn River, which is now known as Custer River, we made our way to the east side, where a well-worn trail led up a gradual slope. It was a rough path, little more than a faint track that wound its way through the sagebrush and coarse grass. The ground here was dry and barren, with no trees or rocks to offer shelter. As we crested the rise, we looked down into a ravine that stretched nearly half a mile, its gentle slopes devoid of any natural cover. This desolate stretch of land was where we came across the remains of the fallen, 18 men, arranged in 6 piles, each marked with a makeshift tombstone of a teepee pole stuck in the earth. One of the tombstones bore a white sombrero, a relic from a member of the 7th Cavalry, with 2 bullet holes through it and a long gash as if it had been hacked with an axe. Nearby, we found an old axe with a rusted, darkened blade, likely used by the women of the Indian camp during their brutal mutilation of the soldiers' bodies. It was a sickening sight. These were not warriors in battle, but savage acts of disrespect toward the dead. Not far from this grisly scene, we found the carcasses of 2 horses, their bodies stripped of flesh by animals, their bones bleaching in the sun. As we continued, the evidence of the battle grew even more unsettling. A little further on, we came across another heap of bones, this one containing the remains of 3 men, lying alongside the skeleton of a horse that had obviously been killed and used as a makeshift breastwork. The thought of it, the dead soldiers using their own horses as shields against the enemy, was a stark reminder of the desperation and finality of the stand they had made. Moving on, we followed a trail along the crest of a divide, which separated the river from the ravine. The path was strewn with broken equipment, clothing, and the scattered bones of both men and animals. The further we went, the more we realized how complete the destruction had been. It was a place of death, no longer the site of a battle, but a solemn graveyard for the fallen. After about 300 yards, we arrived at a knoll, the final position where Custer and what remained of his command made their last stand. It was easy to imagine what had transpired here. Custer, resolute and determined, would have been standing firm, loading and firing his rifle alongside his men. With each shot, he must have glanced toward the bluffs to the north, hoping beyond hope that Reno's column, which he had desperately called for, would be arriving any moment. It is a tragedy that Reno, despite being just a few miles away, never came to their aid. Custer's failure to receive the promised support was a bitter betrayal, one that many of us still speak about with anger and regret. The knoll where Custer died was only slightly elevated above the surrounding land, offering a good view of the surrounding terrain. From that position, the officers and men could see the enemy closing in from all sides. But the small group of cavalrymen, outnumbered and outgunned, had little hope of survival. The Sioux and Cheyenne were too powerful. At the top of the hill, where Custer and his men made their stand, we found the remains of 4 soldiers and their horses. One of the horses found here was said to be Custer's own mount, ironically named Victory, though according to Sioux and Cheyenne accounts, the horse was captured during the battle and would never have been near the place of his death. We rode back toward Tongue River, the image of the battlefield seared into our minds. We could not help but wonder if things might have turned out differently had Reno pressed forward, had he made the effort to push through and fight his way to Custer's rescue. Trumpeter John Martin, who had been sent by Custer himself to urge Reno to hurry to the aid of his command, believed it was possible for Reno to have reached them in time. But the truth, as we all know, is far more complex. Reno had his own men to worry about, half of whom were already dead or missing, and he was outnumbered by at least 10-1. To abandon his defensive position at that point would have been suicidal. It was not his duty to save Custer, but rather Custer's responsibility to provide support to Reno's position. The true failure was in Custer's leadership, not Reno's. The whole affair remains shrouded in mystery and controversy, with no easy answers. We know one thing for certain. Custer and his men died because of a failure of command, a failure of support, and a failure of leadership that ultimately cost them their lives. As we reflected on this battlefield, the image of the men who perished here stayed with us, brave men who were left to die without honor or proper burial, and who were forgotten for too long by those who should have cared for them.